Brendan Nelson, welcome to Lessons in Leadership. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Peter.
Let's get straight to some questions about your experience as Defence Minister. Why don't we start with you telling us the story of how did you get the job? What was the story there?
Well, it was January 2006 and I was on the last day of my 2 weeks leave, having been Minister for Education, Science and Training for 4.5 years. And I was mowing the lawns and I was emptying the catcher and the mower was off and my mobile phone rang and it was John Howard. And Robert Hill had retired both from the Defence Ministry and from the Senate late in 2005, and there'd been a lot of speculation about who might be the next Defence Minister. And John Howard said to me, Brendan, I'm ringing to ask you if you would be prepared to move from education to defence. And of course I said yes. And interestingly, when Robert Hill had retired, my wife had said to me, she said, do you think there's any chance you could get moved to defence? And I said, no, of course not. I said I would expect it might be Nick Minchin or someone like that who's very close to the Prime Minister. But so in other words, I was really very, very surprised.
You weren't really expecting then to be asked by John Howard to take on the role?
Of course not, and I wasn't coveting it, and I knew that whomever John Howard chose to be his Defence Minister would be someone in whom he would have a lot of confidence. And whilst I had a very good relationship with John Howard and respected him, as I still do, I was not one of his close confidants or anything like that. So I thought that Nick Minchin would probably get moved. But I said to my wife, if Nick does go to defence, I may get moved to finance because I'm good with the figures. But anyway.
Were you pleased with the offer?
I was overwhelmed with both excitement, a sense of responsibility that was going to come to me, and a little bit apprehensive about, and I'll be honest with you, you question whether you are up for the task, so to speak. And when John Howard called me, he said, Brendan, I take a bit of interest in defence and defence matters, which is an understatement.
Yeah.
John Howard, it had been said of him by Robert Hill, famously. Robert Hill said that when he was Defence Minister, he was the minister assisting the Prime Minister for Defence. And John Howard certainly took an immense interest in defence issues, and I regarded that as an extremely positive and helpful thing for me to have a Prime Minister that was so deeply committed to the portfolio.
Did Robert Hill give you any advice? He'd been Minister for a number of years, actually, about 4 years, I think. What did he say to you when you spoke to him?
Well, it's interesting. I tried to speak to Robert in the first week that I was in the portfolio, and one of the strange things that I discovered when I did become a minister is that often the outgoing minister, there would be no handover or anything like that. That if there was some sort of handover or briefing, it would be arranged informally. And I had tried to see Robert, and I think he was overseas, and it had not been possible for me to speak directly to him. And I was about 2 months into the portfolio, and a lot of things had happened when I finally did get to speak to him. And he gave me some very frank advice about defence, which I regret that I hadn't received in the first week. But anyway, there you go.
Can you share what that advice was?
Well, look, Robert said to me, defence is an immensely complex organisation. It is extraordinarily important. The relationship between the Minister and the Department of Defence and the military is not like that of other portfolios. And he also said, amongst other things, apart from expressing his admiration for the men and women in uniform and defence generally, he said you have to be very careful about accepting all of the advice that comes to you, especially that which comes after some sort of crisis or some sort of event. He said because circumstances change very quickly, the advice can change, and that's something that perhaps I learned the hard way to some extent.
Well, we'll get to some of those hard issues that you had to deal with as Minister, but going into the portfolio, you would have had some expectations, some hopes. I guess maybe a thought that defence had been quite a tough job for a number of your predecessors. What were those hopes and expectations, and were they borne out by the experience of being minister?
Well, I had had the great fortune to be Parliamentary Secretary for Defence in 2001, so the junior minister, and my minister then was Peter Reith. And Peter Reith had taken the view that I should have more responsibility than my immediate predecessor had in that role. And so I had worked across cadets, Defence IT, Emergency Management Australia, management of the Defence estate, the acquisition, management and then disposal of defence properties, and a range of issues. So as you would know from your own background, that didn't mean that I answered questions in question time. I wasn't involved directly in defence acquisitions or deployments or anything of the sort. But it gave me a great opportunity. In fact, it's a job that I loved. It's one of the most rewarding and enjoyable years that I spent in my parliamentary career. One of the decisions I was able to personally drive was the redevelopment and modernisation of the propellant factory at Mulwala. The disposition then of the Department of Defence and indeed Minister Reith was to close it down. And in a pre-9/11 environment, I was able to persuade the Cabinet that we should invest in it, modernise it, and to have our own sovereign independence in relation to propellant manufacturing. So I'd had some experience and then also on my mother's side of the family, a very long history of service in the military, going back to the Gallipoli landing. So to come into the defence portfolio was something that I certainly regarded, and I've got to say to you, I still regard as, in my professional life, as the greatest privilege that I have had. I also was well aware that it was a portfolio where commentators would generally say, well, it generally ends a person's political career, that there are very few that go into defence and then come out and go on to other, and perhaps they would say greater things. So I was aware of that, but it didn't in any way shape the way I approached the job when I came into it. And I'd also say to you that in an earlier life, of course, I'm a doctor, a medical practitioner, and when I was president of the Australian Medical Association, we used to bemoan the fact that we couldn't get a health minister who knew something about health. We'd get a passing parade of people of various skills and natural abilities and intellect, but we thought, why can't we get someone that actually knows something about health? Once I moved on and into the Parliament and certainly becoming a minister, you realise the minister's job is not to be an expert. Your job, the key task, is the application of intellectual rigour to the process of exercising judgment, drawing on all the expertise that you have both within your department and indeed outside it. And that's something. So, for example, when John Howard called me in late January, 2 days after which I was being sworn in at Yarralumla, if he had said to me, Brendan, I'm concerned about new air combat capability, could you have a look at the F-35 and reassure me we're doing the right thing? Even though I had been a member of the Cabinet of a government which had signed on for F-35 4 years earlier, I would have had no idea what he was talking about. So now that will unsettle and concern, I think, a lot of people, but in one sense you'd be concerned, but in another, that's why you're there.
Yeah, I've used the phrase myself talking about ministers that what you want is to have sort of gifted amateurs, and I don't mean that in any negative way, but you want people that can bring a sharp intellect to the business, not necessarily being mired down in any of the internal fights that might be happening in the department.
And inevitably, if you have a very deep experience in a particular area and then you become the minister for it, let's take Attorney General out of it, you understandably bring your own biases and prejudices to the case and the task of being the minister. So anyway, but that's how I came into it.
Let's talk about workload. I think Defence is also known as a portfolio that really pressures their ministers with a high workload. How did you spend your day? How did you find the workload? What was that like for you?
It is, to this day, the hardest job I have ever had, but also in many ways the most rewarding. And I have always worked hard, and there were two occasions on which I worked all day, I worked all night, worked all day. I'm not complaining, I'm just reflecting how intense it was. We had, in those days, when I was the minister, there was not a minister for defence industry. You had a minister assisting. In my case, it was Bruce Bilson. And we had 10 deployments at that time when I came into the portfolio. 4 of them were big: Iraq, Afghanistan, Solomon Islands, East Timor. We were equipping the Defence Force at a very significant rate, investing heavily in it, driven heavily by John Howard, of course. So there were a lot of decisions to be made around equipment acquisitions. And we were growing the size of the Defence Force. So I found it, and as Robert Hill had then said to me, it is like no other government department. So after 6 months of being Minister for Education, I knew if the Secretary of the department gave me advice on something, I could rely on it 100%. But I learned as I went through the defence portfolio, given the nature of defence, that that couldn't always be the case. And I always remember my very first meeting with the then Secretary, Rick Smith, and the Chief of Defence, Air Chief Marshal Angus Houston. At the end of the meeting with my Chief of Staff, Maria Fernandez, Rick Smith leaned over the Secretary and he said, "Minister, the only thing that we can guarantee you is that we will let you down." And they left the room and I turned to Maria and I said, "What do you think he means by that?" It didn't take long to find out.
Yes. In fact, I was involved in writing the incoming minister's brief for you, and I remember Rick wrote in the introduction to that, can't quite get the precise words, but it was something like, always ask twice, because you can't necessarily be guaranteed that the defence advice will be correct the first time round.
Yeah. Which is what Robert Hill had subsequently said to me, and which I would give if I was giving or asked to give advice to an incoming Minister of Defence. That's a part of the advice that I too would give.
So what was it like dealing with the department, dealing with the ADF? You obviously spent countless hours engaging with senior people in the organisation. How did you find that?
I found it a great experience. It was different in the sense that I had a uniformed, very obviously by definition the most senior person in the Australian Defence Force, a lifetime committed to, in his case, the Royal Australian Air Force, and then the service chiefs, and then a myriad of people of various ranks in different areas. The complexity of trying to work out some of the basics in terms of what the ranks are and what the various roles that people have, and then the uniformed people working alongside civilians, highly intelligent, deeply committed public servants who are also wanting to do the very best they can for Australia and to serve the minister. And often you could see the tensions in terms of tensions of cultures between the uniformed and the civilian people in the Australian public service. Part of the challenge too, and I know you're calling this series Lessons in Leadership, and in my opinion, leadership isn't something that can be taught, even though there's an entire industry dedicated to it, but it is something that can be learned. And the qualities that inform leadership can be revealed. And by observation of and absorption and reflection upon the leadership qualities and experiences we see in others, we learn leadership. And the power of it is in the story. So as you go through your own life and your experiences, in telling the stories of them, you are helping others, as I say, to learn leadership. So for me, it was 2 days after John Howard had called me. I'm driven out of Yarralumla. I'm the minister. there's absolute chaos in my Parliament House office because my staff had been moving me from one office, the Education Minister's office, to my new office in Defence. And obviously secure communications have to be wired into the office. There's a whole range of things that have to be done. And so in the midst of that chaos, I am then setting my priorities. And I had made the decision, which I'm so pleased I did, to invite Maria Fernandez, who had been my Chief of Staff for 2.5 years in education, to come with me into Defence. She, like me, was what you would describe, in her case, I described her as a gifted amateur. And I had originally recruited her from the public service in education because I'd been so impressed with the work she'd done around the modelling of finances in university funding. But so for me, it was like a pyramid. So I'd start with the fundamentals. What is the size of the budget? Where are the major areas in which that budget is allocated? What is the shape and nature of the Defence Force? What are the key elements of the portfolio to which I need to apply immediate attention? And what do I need to learn as quickly as I possibly can? Where are the potential pitfalls? What are the early decisions that have to be made? And of course, through all of that, going back to John Howard's comments to me, to make sure that in my decision making, I have a sense of what he would want and want me to be focused upon. It was the first, I found in my ministerial career, the most dangerous period is that first 6 weeks. And I went into it as I said, in late January. The budget would be coming in May. The budget preparation was already in train, of course, because it starts in October the preceding year. And then I had to read voluminous budgetary documents to get my head around what was currently being proposed and developed for the budget that was coming up. And then, of course, to insert into it, with a degree of authority, what I thought should be in the budget, or indeed to take some things out.
When did you feel that you were in control and sort of comfortable with the job?
Well, I had got through the budget process in the sense of settling what would be in the budget, and it would include a bid for the first 4 C-17s. It would also include a bid for a 3% real compounding annual increase in the defence budget over the subsequent decade. And I had gone to the Middle East, I'd gone through the Gulf states, I had been to Afghanistan and Iraq. I felt that I had the fundamentals of the portfolio, at least within my own mind, that I was across them. And then we had the tragedy of the death of Jake Kovco in Baghdad, the first death that we would have in Iraq, and then the circumstances that followed that in terms of the wrong body being repatriated to Australia, and then the report being lost about why the body had been lost, and I found that, well, first and foremost for the Kovco family itself, an extremely distressing and upsetting series of experiences. But I found then the hard way that the advice that comes to you is something that you don't just double check, you triple check, and for reasons that not because anybody's trying to do the wrong thing or anything like that, but because you've got a very large organisation, you've got a long supply chain of information getting to the minister, that information needs to be tested, interrogated, and whereas previously when I'd been Education Minister, if we had a major problem or something that needed to be explained to the public, my natural instinct, indeed my responsibility, was to explain it to the public. And here we had this extraordinary set of circumstances surrounding the death of a soldier and his repatriation to Australia and so on, and of course my natural feeling and my responsibility was I have to explain this to the Australian people. Whereas the normal way for Defence to do it would be the Minister makes a perfunctory statement, a relevant Chief of Defence will say we're going to have an inquiry and we'll get back to you in 6 months when we've had a look at it. So I can now understand why they take that approach.
Few agencies of the federal government generate crises in the way that Defence can generate crises, because people's lives can be lost, as was the sad case with Jake Kovco. How did you approach dealing with the organisation at that particular moment? I mean, this was obviously quite almost a defining stage of your time as Defence Minister. I mean, I recall my role back in the department at the time was attempting to control public affairs, and it was probably the worst week of publicity that Defence had for a very long time over the succession of errors that took place around Kovco's death and then his botched repatriation. Can you give us a little bit of insight about how were you engaging with the Secretary and the CDF at that time? And I'd also like to hear your views about the role of John Howard as Prime Minister in this situation as well.
Well, I had just got into bed in Sydney on a Friday night and just got to sleep. It was just after midnight, and the CDF called me to say that we had a soldier in Baghdad who had received what seemed to be a single gunshot wound to the head, who was seriously wounded and had been transferred to the hospital for intensive treatment. So having received that information, I then I made 2 phone calls. I phoned the Prime Minister's Principal Private Secretary to let him know what I had been told, and I also rang Robert McClelland, who was the Shadow Minister for Defence. I received another phone call about 3 a.m. From the CDF to say that the soldier had died. The following morning I had to be in Melbourne to do a big event around Defence Force reserves, and there would be a lot of media at this event. So I naturally was asking the CDF a lot of questions of what did we know of the soldier, the circumstances, the family, and so on and so forth. And then when inevitably I was asked about this by the media, I faithfully reported some of what I had been told. Not all of it is appropriate to be in the public arena. When I had my conversation with the CDF on the Saturday morning, I asked, how long will it take for Private Kovco's body to be returned to Australia? And he said 48 hours. And I asked how this would be done. And he said, well, a C-130 ramp ceremony from Baghdad to Kuwait, and then a private contractor will bring him back to Australia. And I said, oh, really? I said, we don't use our own aircraft. He said, no, we don't. Our C-130s don't have the range to be doing that, and we have a very good relationship with Kenyans, the company that does this. So okay, I didn't know. But I was already waking up to them. Mm-hmm. So when the media asked me that question, how long will it take? I said around several days. Subsequently, once I had gone much further into these issues, I learned that the United States, which tragically is doing this so frequently, has a best practice of around 8 days. So, and all of that reflected the fact that our country, thankfully, had not had contemporary experience in the repatriation of our dead from remote parts of the world. So again, it's no one is to be criticised in that, but that's what I was told. And there was some speculation for several days about the safety of the Steyr rifle and so on. And it was only, I think on the Monday, that I discovered that it was a sidearm. It wasn't the Steyr rifle. So then there was a rapid investigation, a quick assessment, I think the military call it, and I was given advice about what they believe had happened. And then the family, understandably, were concerned that the reporting of this suggested that in some way it had been an act of self-harm. And they were very hurt by that. So I thought I should correct that, which I did. And in fact, and then we had the repatriation, and I thought my natural human instincts, I thought when I looked at the family profile, I realised they were what we would call battlers. They were what I'd call fair dinkum Australians. They were living down in Victoria, regional Victoria. So the body was to come into Melbourne at midnight, midnight. So I imagined this family being at the Melbourne airport at midnight, waiting for a loved husband, son to return. Mm-hmm. So I thought, right, okay. So I thought I'll take the Prime Minister's special purpose aircraft, his RAAF BBJ, down to Sale, pick the family up with the Chief of Army and the RSM, and we'll take the family to Melbourne and pay our respects to the repatriation. And as we were waiting at the airport at Fairburn, the Chief of Army received a phone call, and I could see the blood run from his face, literally. And he hung up and he said, "Sir," I said, "What's happened?" He said, "Sir, you're not going to believe it." I said, What? He said, "I've just been informed the wrong body is on the plane." I said, "You're damn right I don't believe it." So I made some phone calls and satisfied myself that we had a major problem. So I just said to the Chief of Army, well, there's only one thing we can do, and that's we're going to get on that plane and we're going to Sale, and I'm going to have to tell them what's happened. Yeah. So the RAAF plane took off to Sale, and I phoned John Howard from the plane. By this stage it's about 10:30, and he was at the lodge and had just gone to bed, and explained to him what had happened, what I understood with the circumstances, what I was doing. And he said to me, "Look, you're doing the right thing. This is extraordinarily difficult." He said, "Please don't hesitate to contact me if I can help in any way." And then, look, I won't go into too much detail, but at Sale, I had phoned ahead to the commanding officer and asked if Mrs. Kovco and the immediate family could be put in a small room so I could speak to them directly with the Chief of Army. And it was an extremely difficult conversation, and Mrs. Kovco, Jake's widow, wanted to speak to the Prime Minister, and I made the decision that I would call him, and I woke him up and explained that she would like to speak to him. And it was a very, very robust one-sided conversation, very robust. And then John Howard came back, so he was on the phone back to me, and he asked me if I could move away from the family so he could speak to me privately. And I thought, here we go. But instead, he said, "Brendan, I admire what you're doing. This is just so extraordinarily difficult." He said, "If you have to call me any time through the night, please do so." Yes. And that was John Howard.
It speaks to the character of the man, absolutely.
Yes, and then in Melbourne, when we got to Melbourne, we went through it again with the other members of the family. And in fact, that was one of the nights that I really didn't go to bed. So Rick Smith, the secretary, he too was up all night. We were trying to piece together what had happened, how had this happened. So at 5 a.m, the Chief of Army and I did a press conference at the Melbourne airport, and me explaining to the nation that this error had occurred, and of course, as much as I could, describe the impact on the family. So up until then, I thought I'm through the danger period from the minister's point of view. Yeah. And then, of course, we had the subsequent issues around the report into why the body had been lost, having been left in a computer in a Qantas lounge. Yeah.
Brendan, all of these stories have sort of tragic cause, and then what happens is that the media kind of takes hold and runs with the crisis, almost separate to the actual merits of whatever the particular story was. I think you've outlined very well the sort of terrible list of accidents and mistakes that took place to bring you to the RAF-based Sale on that evening. How do you? What's your reflections of dealing with the media then in the subsequent days and weeks which followed, where that pile-on continued for quite a period of time?
Well, of all of the people who should express any upset about what happened, I should be the last, because it's the family first and foremost that suffered through all of that. And what meant the most to me, however, was about a year after that. A year later, in 2007, Shelley Kovco's father wrote to me, and a handwritten note, and he said, "We've dealt with a lot of people over the last year when we've gone through this." He said, "You're the only person who has always been straight with us." and honest with us. And he said it means a great deal. And that meant a great deal to me too, I can assure you. Yeah. The media side of it was extremely intense. I was, obviously I had to administer the portfolio and do the things that you have to be doing and have to keep doing as the minister, in addition to dealing with this criticism, much of which fell to me, even though of course I personally had not been directly involved in the circumstances that led firstly to the death, and then secondly to the repatriation, and then thirdly to the loss of the report. But my own view was that I was the minister, and even though I personally had not done any of these things, that I should bear the responsibility for them. And I also made sure that the military leadership understood that I was taking it, and I did. And I think it's fair to say they respected me for doing so, and I respected them. However, I also think that privately they were thinking, well, I wish the minister would just simply stay out of this and let us handle it. And their way of handling it would be to say very little to the public.
Mm-hmm. Was it your worst time as minister?
It was. It was. Each of the deaths on my watch were the worst times. Yes. And Jake Kovco's death was the first of those in the 2 years that I was the minister. So it was, shall I say, character building.
Let's talk about the experience of combat operations, Brendan. I don't really want to ask you so much about dealing with those terrible individual deaths. We all had that experience, but your time almost uniquely was a time of high operational tempo. As you said, 4 major operations happening pretty much simultaneously, soldiers at risk 24/7. How did you manage that as minister? What did you see your role, firstly, in that type of situation?
Well, I saw my role in terms of the combat operations as constantly testing what our Defence Force was recommending it should do and wanted to do. And now, in our system here in Australia, our government, our political leaders make a decision that we need a particular outcome, a strategic outcome, military outcome, and we hand it over to the military leadership, and quite rightly then the military leadership then applies whatever forces, whatever it needs to get the outcome that the government of the day wants. But I also realised from my earlier experiences that whilst these are men and women with immense expertise and professionalism that I don't have nor will ever have, that there are times when it needs a person with, shall I say, an independent eye to have a look at it and just check that things are the way they ought to be. And that's how I saw it. And I was constantly looking at the decisions, what was being applied to the operations from the point of view of the average soldier, sailor, airman or woman. So, for example, helicopters in East Timor. There was some discussion that we perhaps might not have our Black Hawk Army helicopters doing aeromedical evacuations and other things in East Timor, that instead we'd have civilian helicopters. And I said, well, there's absolutely no way that's happening. From my point of view, particularly at night, I want our people flown around by Australian Army helicopters. So there are those sort of discussions. And then toward the end of 2006, a discussion about withdrawing our special forces, the view being that the job was basically done, that they'd been tasked to do. And of course I was involved in decisions around that, as was the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. So that's how I saw it. In the main, it's a question, for me it was a question of accepting the advice and of course supporting the chiefs in what they wanted to do.
Brendan, another thing I wanted to talk with you about is the experience of defence equipment acquisition. I know how this is for ministers. Very large, thick folders arrive on your desks with incredibly complex information about the pros and cons of buying equipment which can be billions and billions of taxpayer dollars. I particularly want to talk to you about the Super Hornet decision, but before we get to that, more generally, how did you sort of engage with this particular part of the portfolio?
Well, in some cases, antennae and particular pieces of specific equipment for submarines, I'd have to read the submission 3 times. I'd have to ask people lots of questions. And the way I approached it was that me as the civilian, the minister, I had to explain to my fellow members of the National Security Committee, who are also civilians, I had to explain what it was that I believed we needed to purchase and why, in terms that were both understandable and compelling. Because when you think about it, whether it's the Attorney General, the Foreign Minister, Prime Minister, the members of the Security Committee, they're members of the Cabinet with all of the normal Cabinet issues you've got to get across. And then you've got the NSC items that are coming to the Cabinet, a lot of which they are not directly involved with, and they have to be persuaded to sign off on $1, $3, $5 billion of taxpayers' money being spent on something on the advice of the minister, supported by Defence itself. So I always wanted, and we had a lot of things that were going through the NSC on the equipment side at that point. For some of the meetings, I might have 5 or 6 papers, matters to be determined in terms of equipment acquisitions, for example. So I would frequently spend my entire weekend just reading. And I learned when I was Minister for Education that you have to have more information in your head than any other person in the room other than your own officials. So, because often it's arm-to-arm combat with the Secretary of the Department of Finance, with the Treasurer, the Secretary of Treasury, your own Prime Minister. And what I was determined to do was that when I went into that room, that I didn't have to look at a sheet of paper, that I knew everything that was in the submission, and I could confidently and competently argue and prosecute the case that I had brought to them. And so I went from late January 2006, not knowing what an F-35 Joint Strike Fighter was. I went from there to May that year, delving very deeply into Wedgetail, Vigilair, centre barrels on classic Hornets, JASM, the complexity of the software line items in a F-35, an eye for the politics of the US Congress and what that would mean, and also looking at the changing geostrategic circumstances for Australia. And I remember coming back from a Proliferation Security Initiative, PSI exercise in Darwin, and I'd been to Tyndall, been taken up in a classic Hornet, and I said to the CDF on the way back, this was about May 2006, and I said to Air Chief Marshal Houston, I am not going to go to Washington in December this year and sign the PFS, Production Sustainment Follow-Through and Development MOU on the F-35 until I'm satisfied of 2 things. The first is I want to know precisely what the Australian industry involvement in the project is, what the dollar value of it is, and then what other options we have to further grow it. And the second, I said to him, I want to know what the fallback option is. And the CDF said, well, Minister, what do you mean the fallback option? And I said, well, I'm very concerned about this. I said the new air combat capability, as you know only too well, is a complex variety of moving parts, of which the F-35 is one significant element, but there's a lot more to it than that. And should we see further delays in the development of the entire plan, we need to have a fallback option. And he said to me, well, Minister, that's easy, it's all done. And I said, well, what is it? And he said, it's Super Hornet. And I said, that's great. I'd like to see it. So as things went on, and what had happened was that John Howard, as Prime Minister, was going to Washington to, I think he was having a state dinner with President George W. Bush and doing things you expect the Australian Prime Minister would be doing in the United States. And I said to Defence, I said to the Secretary, I want to see every brief that is going to the Prime Minister for his trip before it goes to him. And I well remember reading the brief around Wedgetail, the brief around Vigilair, which were two projects then of Boeing's, and I said to my Chief of Staff, this is a bit different from what I'm being told. There's something here that doesn't seem right. We delved further into it, and in doing so revealed that there was a much greater delay on both of those projects than we had anticipated, or certainly understood at that point. And so I was becoming increasingly concerned. Well, firstly, the new air combat capability plan to which Australia had signed on in 2002 was, is and remains the right plan for Australia. Absolutely no question whatsoever. But one of the things that you learn in leadership is you have to have the imaginative capacity to see the world through the eyes of other people. So for me, as a civilian, I imagined the uniformed military people would see the minister as an obstacle to be overcome, someone who is coming into the portfolio for an indeterminate period of time, and they would be very concerned. They wouldn't want the minister of the day interfering with a plan which they have developed after a lifetime of commitment to and deeply immersed, in this case, Australia's air combat power. So as I went progressively through that year of 2006, I became concerned that we faced the prospect of a gap emerging. I was told by the chiefs, hand on heart, the first F-35s, Minister, will land in Australia in 2012. That's what I was told. So in the end, what I did was, with my staff, my aviation advisor, my chief of staff, relevant staff in my office, we looked at every year. And I hesitate to say this given the history of these things, but we put sheets of paper on the wall, along one wall in my office, and we had every year, 2006, 7, 8, 9, out to 2018, every element of the program, and looked at where it was at the moment, at that time. This was mid-2006, and one of the decisions had to be the retirement of F-111, I should have said. Out to 2018, where it is now, where it might reasonably go, each element, and what the consequences would be. So the end result was, I was convinced we faced the real risk of having a capability gap of air combat power. So I arranged to go and see, and then compounding this, by the way, was F-111s. The F-111s, magnificent aircraft. We were the only country in the world left flying them, and we'd had some issues. We'd had an engineering issue. We had a fire in an F-111. I was told that the pilot should have bailed out, but the pilot navigator got the fire out and landed the aircraft. We had a wheel fell off one. I had asked the Chief of Air Force how long we could possibly fly them for. And then as these other issues were emerging with elements of the new air combat capability plan, at a meeting a month after we'd had an earlier meeting where a drop-dead date had been given to me, the drop-dead date went right. It went further out. And when he left, I turned to Maria Fernandez, my Chief of Staff, and I said, it's a conspiracy of optimism. I said, these people are going to tell me whatever they will tell me to stop me interfering with the plan. So we worked up options. I went to see John Howard. The Secretary of PM&C was with him, his Chief of Staff, Arthur Sinodinos, his security advisor. I went with my Chief of Staff, and I laid it all out on the table. And I said, these are the options. You know, we could lease a squadron of aircraft. We could, there are a couple of other options I won't put on the public record, but one of them is to buy a squadron of Super Hornets. He said, what do you recommend? I said, I think we've got no choice. We've got to buy Super Hornets. He said, okay, work it up, bring it to Cabinet. And so we did in, I think, late November that year for the first consideration, and then the decision was made in March 2007. And it was very disappointing because no one in Defence would publicly support the decision. I think Zed Roberton, who was then the commanding officer of the F-18 squadron, he publicly supported it, and there was a lot of derision from the media, 60 Minutes and a whole variety of people, including ASPI people, I might add, who were very critical of the decision. But I said to the chiefs at the time, I said, look, I know I'm a doctor working in the defence space, but I'm many things, but a slow learner's not one of them. And you've all taught me the importance, the critical importance of air combat capability and air power, that it is the most important capability the nation has to protect the free movement of Navy and Army. And yet I'm deeply concerned that we face a potential gap. And in fact, I felt the biggest risk to the program was not in the complexity of the F-35. It was actually in the politics of the US Congress and the partner nations and their capitals. So the decision was made, and one of the reasons we were able to make it, it was $6.6 billion in 2007, including the infrastructure to support the aircraft. But one of the reasons we were able to make it was because we had a strong economy, we had a very, very strong budgetary position, and we were able to do so. And one of the things that I really appreciated was that several of the people that were so scathingly critical of me at the time have subsequently written to me and apologised, including two people from the media. You don't get that every day.
Yeah. Well, Brendan, you have the satisfaction of knowing now in 2021 that was absolutely the right call. There would have been a very significant gap in air combat capability had Super Hornet not been brought into the mix. Brendan, one of the things we should talk about is Sea Sprite, which of course was an acquisition that plagued a number of governments. Tell me about your experience of dealing with that.
Well, of course, that decision had been made in the mid-90s, and we had 11 Sea Sprite helicopters, and it was, shall I say, less than functional aircraft. And so, again, as I did with everything, I delved into it. So I remember asking the Chief of Navy, I said, well, just how important to Australia's defence is it for us to have Sea Sprite helicopters? And he said, oh, Minister, we have to have them. They're absolutely essential for littoral patrolling and to have a helicopter off a ship which goes around peninsulas and places you can't easily see in other ways and so on. And so I said, okay. See, again, you're the Minister. You're starting from basic principles. So I'm asking, why do we actually need them? I said, okay, we have not had this capability now for the best part of a decade, if not more. Yet no one has yet said to me, oh, Minister, our defence is severely exposed because we haven't got helicopters of a Sea Sprite variety that can do this sort of work. So I went very much into the detail, and what I discovered, the origin of the helicopters was in 1994. There was to be an offshore patrol vessel. It was a certain size. It needed to be a relatively small helicopter that would go onto it. The decision was made for Sea Sprite that, unlike the New Zealanders, we would have the bells and whistles digital version and so on. And then the Keating government fell, the Howard government was elected, and then in 1996 the decision was made on the advice of Navy to go ahead and acquire the Sea Sprite helicopters. So of course, when I come into the portfolio, I then discover that the helicopters can't land on a ship in Sea State 3 or 4. If they fired one missile, they had to fire the second because it couldn't carry one missile, it had to fire them both. I then discovered that you had to be of a certain size to get in the helicopter, what they call the anthropogenic form. And then there were a multitude of problems with the digital system in the helicopter. So I made the decision that we need to get out of it. And I said to, people find this perhaps humorous, so I said to the Chief of Navy at the time, I said, well, Russ, let's pretend for a moment that we are husband and wife. If you feel more comfortable, I'll be the wife. And I said, we're sitting in our lounge room. We've got this Sea Sprite helicopter out in the garage, which is our car. We've done the engine. We've done the gearbox. We've done all the rust through the bodywork. We've done the diff. And now we discover that the computer system that runs a whole car, it's not working, and further to that, I can't fit in it because I put on weight. I said, don't you think we would by now, if not earlier, have said, look, we've just got to write this off, we've got to get out of it. So I said, I'm going to work up, and I want you to work up for me, a proposal for us to get out of Sea Sprite and let's acquisition to a across the Navy single platform. So part of the proposal was that we would acquire 4 second-hand, if you like, US Navy Seahawks. We would up the Seahawk size of the fleet, and we would retire Sea Sprite and see if we could find a buyer for them. And so I remember meeting the officials of Command in the United States. And Command had gone out of helicopters, I think about 2001, and into guitars. And when I left them, yes, and when I left the meeting, I said to my staff, doesn't it worry you when the minister actually knows more about the helicopters than the people who made them? And rather amusingly, Peter Costello, the Treasurer, he said to me, this is 2007, early 2007, he said, Brendan, why did we get 11? Why didn't we get 10 or 12? Why did we get 11? And I said, brace yourself. I said, we wanted 10, but Command said at the time, if we go for a 1% liquidated damages provision in the contract, they'll throw in an extra helicopter. Now, to reassure the Australian taxpayers, in 2021, that decision would never ever be made today. That the rigour of the procurement process now is such that you would never have those sort of decisions made. It doesn't mean we won't have mistakes going forward, but nothing of the scale or nature of that.
It's an interesting reflection, Brendan, because I was Chief of Staff to Ian McLaughlin when the Sea Sprite decision was made. And I can tell you that at that particular time, 96 we're talking about, defence acquisition was something that was really run in 2 cabinet meetings over the course of a year.
Yeah.
And you'd get a single folder with maybe 5 to 10 pages per equipment proposal, which was almost like the manufacturer's brochure rather than amazingly detailed and forensic information that goes forward to Cabinet now for contemporary acquisitions. So I agree, it would not happen in 2021.
Yeah. And when I was going, I had 2 cabinet meetings to push for 2 more battalions for the Australian Army. And for the second meeting, we had agreed, amongst other things, on a certain increased number of Bushmasters. And as I said, I spent every weekend and I'd go through every word, every line of the submission and the appendices, because the cabinet submissions were of a certain number of pages, so a lot of them were in appendix 1, 2, 3 or whatever. And I remember at 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon sitting in my little office in my home in St Ives, and I'm reading Annex 3 to the submission, and I saw a number of Bushmasters was being proposed and therein to be agreed by the Cabinet. And I looked at it and I thought, there's 50 more Bushmasters there than we agreed. So I called my Chief of Staff, Maria, and I said, have you read Annex 3 to the submission? She said, no, not yet. And I said, well, go to page whatever. And I told her the number, and she said, that's not what we agreed. And I said, you're damn right. So first thing on the Monday morning, I asked for the Chief of Army to come and see me.
I'm interested, though, in your story is absolutely fascinating, and it does point to, I think, one of the flaws in terms of how government manages defence, which is so often Prime Ministers and Ministers will front cameras and say, I'm doing this on military advice. And that is almost the sort of the ace that's deployed, beyond which no further conversation is necessary to be entered into. Of course, what you have just described is that a critical role of the Minister is to make judgments that sometimes run counter to the advice that you're getting from the defence organisation. Yeah. What's your reflection on that?
Look, it's absolutely critically important. In almost all cases, the advice that came to me was the advice that I took forward. But there were some occasions, and look, I'll tell you that I'm now 62 years of age, and I have been a medical practitioner, President of the Australian Medical Association. I have served in the Parliament. I've served as a Cabinet Minister, an Opposition Leader, a diplomat, and Director of the Australian War Memorial. With the exception of the medical profession, in all of those cases, the people whom I have led have known more than I will ever know. They've forgotten more than I will ever know. But what I've found with experts from my time in the medical profession through everything I've done since, for all of their magnificent expertise and commitment, they see the world through a straw. And with some exceptions, they have an understandably relatively narrow commitment to whatever it is that they are doing. And the job of the minister is because if the minister wasn't exercising judgment and occasionally, but importantly, saying, no, we're not going to do that, we should instead do something else, well then of course you would just have the public service that would run the country. So the other big decision where I also was involved was in air warfare destroyers. And we had Navantia, with the two-power system of course, we had Navantia competing with Gibson-Cox. And when that process started, I think everybody, including me, believed we would end up with an American ship. But as the process went further we went further into it. And when I opened the Air Warfare Destroyer Systems Centre in Adelaide in October 2006, prior to the official opening, I asked for a briefing from Gibson-Cox and I asked for a briefing from Navantia. Gibson-Cox came in with 20 people. One of the things I've also observed in my life is that the more people that are required to come to explain something to you, the less confident they are in what they're doing. Navantia came in with 3 people. And at the end of the 2 briefings, I said to my Chief of Staff, I said, I'm worried. I'm worried about the complexity of what Gibson-Cox is doing, but I'm also worried that Navantia doesn't think that it has a chance of getting this. I'd like to see the president of Navantia, who came from Spain to see me. And I said to him, I said, you need to understand something, that in this country, whatever the Royal Australian Navy tells you, whatever the Navy leadership tells you, the recommendation on the design of the ship will come from me, and the decision will be made by the Australian government. This is a competition, a real competition. And so I said, whilst I have immense respect for the Royal Australian Navy, I said, in the end, I have to be satisfied that what we recommend is what this country needs. And it's a matter of record, of course, that in the end, we went with Navantia. And there were lots of reasons for that, apart from what was being offered, but also the complexity of the evolved design of the Arleigh Burke. It needed another $100 million then just to get the complete design, probably another $1 billion on the budget that we already had. And what I did was, in the lead up to the NSC discussion, where naturally there'd be a disposition to go for American ships, I went to Singapore to see Robert Gates, who was the US Secretary for Defence, about what were Iraq, Afghanistan, alliance matters. But I asked him, I said, does the United States have a particular view about the design of the ships? And I knew what the answer would be because we were putting GE engines in them. And he turned to the PACOM commander, Admiral Keating, and asked him if he had a view. And he said, no, it's entirely a matter for the Australian government, which ship that it chooses. So long as you've got vertical launch cells, we're comfortable with either a Spanish ship or an American ship. And that was very helpful information.
And of course they've been successful now in the American destroyer replacement, so that's an interesting signal.
Of course. Yeah.
Were they the high points? I mean, what for you was the high point of being Defence Minister?
The high point of all of it was being at Al-Matana in Iraq. There'd been a dust storm. We had troops there, and there's young soldiers had been out on a 3-day patrol, and they'd literally been in about 20 minutes. And I'm the minister, and I go over to meet them all, say hello to them. And this young soldier, grimy face and maybe 20, looked like 25, but he's probably about 20, 21. And I said, how is it? And he said, sir, he said, I think the Iraqis appreciate what we're doing here. He said, this is important stuff. Now, here's a young soldier, and I realised, you know, not just from that, but the many experiences that I had, was these young soldiers, these young Australians, see themselves not just as soldiers, but as aid workers, diplomats, teachers. It makes you so proud, so far away from this country, these young people, an Australian flag on their shoulder, in our name, doing what they did. That's what made me the proudest. And in terms of, you know, pride, if you like, I remember flying. I'd started my day in Kabul in Afghanistan, and we went to Uruzgan, and we got the briefings, met troops, and did all of those things. We went on to Baghdad. We went on to Al-Natana in central Iraq, and then after midnight arrived in one of the Gulf states where our Air Force was based. And so our C-130 comes to a halt, and as I was about to get off the plane, I noticed that maybe 400 or 500 metres further down the tarmac there was an underlit silhouette of what looked like a C-130. And I said to our pilot, I said, is that one of ours? He said, oh yes sir. And I said, oh really? It's still 40 degrees, the heat is very hot. So I said to the CDF, I said, look, I'm going to go down and say hello to these guys. I said, whatever they're doing is important. So I go down there, and there's two guys in overalls, you know, in all this heat, working on this undercarriage of this C-130. And I said, g'day guys, I'm wearing pants, a shirt, and still a tie. And so I said, hey guys, how's it going? And one of them says, yeah, good mate. And I said, oh, that's good. I said, what are you doing? He said, can't you see it? We're bloody well fixing the plane. And I said, well, I'm proud of you. I said, Australians would be proud of you too. Next thing, one of them glanced up, and he's looking at me and the CDF. He goes, oh shit, and he jumped up literally like an ejector seat spring, he and his mate, and then he yells out to someone inside the aircraft to come out, and then these people are tumbling out of the plane. And so I'm speaking to them, and I told them that I said, I wish Australians could see what you're doing, 37 Squadron. And so we go into this little transportable office where they would have their coffee and their breaks or whatever, and there was a blackboard, and it had this fantastic cartoon, chalk cartoon, and it was a sad face on a C-130, which was bent at the end. And across it said, the 37 Squadron Busted Ass Tour, 2007. So I said to the CDF, I said, what's a busted ass tour? And he said, well, sir, I'm not quite sure, Minister, what that means. And anyway, then one of the junior Air Force people said, well, we had a problem with taking off, and the load wasn't in the right spot, and it's done some damage to the rear of the aircraft. But those young blokes said to me, they said, our people are depending on this plane, and we're going to do everything we can to get it serviceable. I mean, that's what makes you proud. Yeah, they were the finest moments.
Two final questions, Brendan. It's been a fascinating conversation. Were you a good Defence Minister? Do you look back and wish that you'd done anything differently in your time?
In hindsight, which is a great thing, my kids have got it, but in hindsight, of course, there are some things that I would do differently. I won't say publicly what they are. In every job I've ever had in my life, I've made mistakes. I've certainly sought to learn from them. And even at the age of 62, I'm sure I'll make more. But it's for others to decide whether you're a good Defence Minister or a not so good Defence Minister. I'm proud of what I was able to do. I don't look back with anything other than pride, less in myself, but more in the staff with whom I worked, the military people with whom I worked. And what means the most to me these days is that it's not, it's not Neil James or Angus Houston or any of these sort of people saying these things to me. But what means the most to me is just men and women who say, "Oh, sir, I met you in Baghdad," and in fact, only yesterday a fellow said to me, in fact, I was going through the security at the Brisbane airport, and the fellow, I've got a face mask on, and this fellow security guy says to me, he said, "Good to see you, sir," and he had a beard and so on, and he'd been in my close personal protection, ex-SAS. So, and when those men and women express their admiration for whatever I was able to do for them, that's what means the most.
Yeah. In my mind's eye, I hope that this series is going to be watched by people maybe like you that have just had a phone call from a Prime Minister and they've been asked to become a future Minister for Defence. To those folk, do you have any advice that you would offer as having been a Defence Minister?
Well, the first is that those men and women who wear and have worn our uniform are extraordinary people, irrespective of whether they're privates or they're generals or air chief marshals. They are extraordinary people, and they are to be treated with the utmost respect. My second advice is that the Australian people have such respect for those men and women and what they do, that as you go through the portfolio, you find that it is far, far less subjected to the political partisanship that characterises pretty much every other part of ministerial responsibility. The third piece of advice, based on my own experience, is that information coming to the minister is like a whale carcass dragged through a pool of sharks. And one of the things that I did relatively early on was that I would go down, whatever brief I got, I'd go down to the very bottom, and I'd find the person whose name and phone number was on the very bottom of that brief. And I would ring them. And I'd talk to them, I'd tell them, which was usually the case, how good it was, how impressed I was with it. I would ask them questions about it. And then there were times also when it's appropriate for the minister to, I said to my ADC at one point, "Could you get me the mobile phone number of the commanding officer of HMAS Geelong, who was at sea? I'd like to give him a call to talk about a brief that's on my desk that I suspect doesn't actually reconcile with what's going on." That's another piece of advice that I'd give. And finally, the other thing is that it'll come to an end. Being the minister will come to an end. And you've got to squeeze every last drop out of every hour of every day that you have the responsibility to do the very, very best you can for them, those men and women who wear a uniform and who are prepared to dedicate their lives not to themselves but to us, and as I discovered, very much their last moments to one another.
Brendan, thank you so much for talking to us.
My pleasure, Peter.